Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this seminar series, Why Behavioral Interventions Work or Don't Work. My name is Theo Sandvoort. I'm the director of the Development Core in the HIV Center for Clinical and Behavioral Studies. And this seminar is organized by the Development Core in collaboration with the Science of Behavior Change program in the Faculty of Medicine. We had a wonderful session a month ago in which we learned about the relevance of theory for understanding and for studying behavior change. We were introduced to the behavior change wheel, and we learned about the different behavioral change techniques and how they relate to mechanisms of actions. So that was very theoretical, and we wanted today to have a session that is a little bit more practical. And we are going to get an introduction from Talea Cornelius, who is an assistant professor in medical sciences, in medicine. And her main focus of work is how to improve the validity of measures of mechanisms that underlie behavior change. And of course, all in order to promote rigor in behavioral health intervention research. She will do the main talking today, but then we have two additional speakers. One is not really a speaker, it's more a guinea pig, it's Brian Kuttner. Brian is an associate professor of clinical medical psychology, and you will hear a lot about his work because, as I said, he's the guinea pig. And then at the end, we will hear from Jeffrey Birk. Jeffrey is an assistant professor of medical sciences at the Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health, also at CUIMC. And he is an expert in emotion regulation, psychophysiology, and effective reactions to acute medical events. That's a very interesting field of research. So we're going to be a little bit more practical. There will be opportunity for questions. And Talea is going to lead us into this session. Talea, up to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I am sometimes technologically impaired, so if someone can let me know when they can see my slides in slideshow mode, and also I just want to make sure that you cannot see my notes. Can you see my notes?
Nope, it looks great.
Wonderful. Okay, yeah, so thank you for the introduction. My name is Talea. I actually got started in grad school in HIV research, and my other focus is really on couples and interdependence in health behavior and health behavior change. So this is exciting for me to be able to talk with this group today. But the thrust of the work that I'm talking about today is my work with the Science of Behavior Change program on mechanistic research and measurement of mechanisms. I tried to make a little brief schedule. This will be very loose, but just to give you an overview of what's to come, I'm going to start by introducing the SOBC method, providing some tools to facilitate behavioral science that are hopefully useful for you. We'll take a brief time for questions after that, hopefully. And then Brian gets to be the guinea pig in a masterclass. We get to watch him step through designing an SOBC method study. There will be another opportunity for questions. And then Jeff, my colleague, who I used to sit next to pre-pandemic in the office every day, is going to give a little wrap up talking about SOBC in his own research. And hopefully he will have some time for questions after that. So very loose schedule, and trying to give you as much time as possible to get the most out of this session. So I'm going to start with the sort of challenge statement. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this problem. Chronic diseases are costly and common. They contribute to many deaths. Many of them are preventable, and they are very expensive. And one of the things we do as behavioral scientists is focus on behavior. Why do we do that? Well, there's a large body of evidence that behaviors play an important role in chronic disease outcomes. And this is a JAMA article from 2018, and you can find that some of these factors, like dietary factors, tobacco use, alcohol and drug use, are huge contributors to global burden of disease. And some of them are even higher than things like blood pressure or BMI. This is a very broad slide. I'm just going to zero in on the field of HIV research for a moment. We know that behaviors are extremely important for things like risk reduction, prevention, and treatment. So think about adherence to PrEP or ARVs. These medicines are amazing, but if people don't take it, you're really not going to get any benefit. Things like condom use, that's a behavior. We need people to engage in this behavior and more. So this is just a very brief list of things that may be among the things that you are focusing on in your own work. So behaviors are among the most important factors that determine whether people do live long and healthy lives. Unfortunately, few of our interventions produce reliable and long-lasting behavior change. And sometimes when we can get a behavior to change, it's hard for people to maintain this change long-term. This has been a big thrust for clinicians, researchers, and policymakers. We really want people to change behavior. Unfortunately, takeaway, we're not that good at it. So this is where SOBC comes in. This was supported by the NIH Common Fund and developed in order to revolutionize behavior change science. We wanted to infuse the study of mechanisms of behavior change across NIH institutes, behaviors, and diseases on a large scale and make a lasting impression on the field. So instead of siloing basic researchers who take mechanisms and try to understand why and how things change from applied researchers, we want to put these two things together and optimize our interventions so we can promote effectiveness, efficacy, scalability, and more. So you heard me say mechanism a couple times. What do I mean by this? Some of you may be familiar with this if you attended the session last month, so this may seem a little bit like a rehash, but we're going to go over it again. Much of our research on behavior change looks like this. We say, here's a behavior. Let's do an intervention. Does the intervention have a change in behavior in the intervention group and less of a change or no change in the control group? If so, yay, our intervention works. If not, then oops, our intervention did not work. Unfortunately, we don't know why. There is a black box between the intervention and the change in the behavior. If it works, great. Why does it work? We might think we know, but we haven't actually measured it or figured out what is the mechanism that changes that behavior. Now I'm going to make a little pivot. This is my favorite analogy. I'm going to conduct an intervention. I come home, my house is dark, I'm hungry, I want to cook, I can't cook in the dark. I'm going to intervene on the darkness and turn on the light. I flip a light switch, there's my intervention. My behavior is the light in the room, the light comes on. Wonderful, my intervention worked, the light came on. Now let's say I come home and I'm ready to cook dinner and I flip the light switch and nothing happens. I have no idea why. I have absolutely no idea why. Is the bulb broken? Is the electricity not working? Maybe I don't even know what those things are. I just know that the thing I pushed didn't result in the thing I wanted. If I measure that mechanism, if I think about electricity as my mechanism, and I'm measuring the flow and measuring the current, I know why my intervention is working. Light switch, electricity, light. And if I flip it and there's no electricity and no light, then I can say, there's a problem with the electrical work, better call somebody. If, for example, one more example from this scenario, if there is electricity flowing, maybe my bulb is burnt out. These are things, though, that I wouldn't know and I wouldn't be able to troubleshoot had I not understood that there's a mechanism, there's something between me flipping the switch and the light going on that I need to pay attention to and I need to measure. This is light bulbs and not behavioral science, but hopefully that's a little bit helpful in terms of understanding why mechanisms matter. Unfortunately, there are very few mechanisms of action included in our funded trials. This is a review from 2018 done by researchers at SOBC, and they found that only 2 of 18 NIH-funded trials actually tested a hypothesized mechanism of an intervention's effect on medication adherence. That is abysmally low. So we have all these interventions. We might even have theory-based or theory-informed interventions, but they don't necessarily test the mechanism. They don't know why an intervention is working or not working. If I flip the intervention switch, have I changed my theoretical construct, and does that result in a change in behavior? If you don't measure it, you can't find out. So here we go. Let's take that black box. We're opening it up. We want to understand what is it that we are changing that results in behavior change. And this is also something we tend to call the experimental medicine approach. We are focusing on underlying mechanisms. So first, what we want to do in this approach, the SOBC approach, I'm going to use my laser pointer, I recently discovered this. We identify a mechanism. This might be from theory. What is it that we think it is that will change behavior? we have to measure the mechanism, and then we influence the mechanism. We actually want our intervention to change that mechanism. And if so, when we change the mechanism, does that result in behavior change? If you do this, then you're able to develop much more targeted interventions. So I can specifically try to do something that will influence the mechanism that I think will result in the most strong, lasting behavior change. So here, I like statistical diagrams. So here's just what we usually see. We see intervention behavior, boom, that's the closed black box. But if we open it up, and this is also a mediation model, I'm gonna call it the triangle, I have a tendency to do that, you can see that I can, instead of just measuring intervention to behavior, I say, all right, what does it flow through? I'm gonna take my intervention, I'm gonna make it see if it changes my mechanism, and then I'm going to see if it changes behavior. What is this indirect effect? A little bit of a background on SOBC and how the method is being implemented. The SOBC Research Network was started in 2015. It brought together these teams of basic and applied scientists to go through these experimental medicine steps. And it started with 8 teams who were tasked with identifying, measuring, and influencing a mechanism of behavior change with a regimen of health behavior adherence, sort of at large. At this point, 6 teams entered a UH3 grant phase to see whether changing the mechanism actually resulted in a change in behavior. There's also the Resource and Coordinating Center, which Jeff and I are a part of. And at some point, we included R21 and our R01 revisions in order to get people to include mechanisms in their research. In this new phase of SOBC, which is the renewal, there are 3 working groups. So one is the Measures Repository and Digital Tool Development, that's at Stanford. There's an Outreach and Dissemination group at BU, and there's an Ontologies and Mechanisms group at Columbia. Busara is on there just because they are our wonderful people who update our Measures Repository, which I will come to later in this presentation. Key domains of mechanisms. So we originally started with 3 broad domains relevant to behavior change: self-regulation, stress reactivity and stress resilience, and interpersonal and social processes. These seemed like promising domains for mechanisms that could help to understand health behavior change, but they are clearly quite broad and clearly not all of the mechanisms. How is SOBC promoting our approach? Well, we want to develop resources for behavior change science and give presentations and share the method and hopefully garner some enthusiasm for testing mechanisms that underlie behavior change. Here is our website. I will just show you right up here. There's the URL. Please feel free to click it. And here's just a quick walkthrough of the website. So this is the front page. There's a little video. And here is an explanation of why mechanisms matter. So talking about why interventions work, understanding why it does or does not work, great animations. So just more education, more information about why this is important. And it also helps to understand walking through the steps. So identifying, measuring, and influencing our mechanisms of behavior change. Okay. I'm always a big fan of these animations. Yeah, and then if we know that we've influenced the mechanism and changed the behavior, then that is great. Not only for targeted interventions, but also for theory development. So then we also have little examples. So here's one from emotional response to interpersonal interactions. Talks about the different measure that is being used within this context, how it's going to be measured, and then what we are trying to influence, changing the mechanism. What is it that's going on here? There are examples, obviously, for self-regulation and stress reactivity, stress resilience as well. We have a little tab for the project. So you'd be able to go through and see, for example, what some of the revisions are or the UH3 projects. I'm skipping the measures tab in this walkthrough because that's a big focus later on. Here's some news. It talks about conferences or press release or paper calls. And we also have resources available. So things like workshop reports or worksheets. And finally, you can see right there, there's a subscribe button. and you can be the first to know about new things happening with SOBC. So I encourage you to go subscribe because we do have a lot of excellent webinars and resources available. All right, so I just walked you through the SOBC method and why it might be important. So promoting the use of the SOBC method and ... I'm really going to zero in on this part of measuring mechanisms because this is very, very important. The tab that I skipped is our measures repository. This is a place where you can find a bunch of measures that have been used by our SOBC researchers. They've been uploaded to the repository. There's open science documentation, Google Scholar integration. We have 113 measures. There are also measures available from Midas and GEM. And you're able to download the measures, download the scoring. The URL for this is down here. I actually made a QR code later, so that might be a little easier. Why does this exist? Basically, measuring mechanisms in a reliable and valid way is paramount to our work at SOBC. We want to develop and apply a common scientific method that is systematic, rigorous, and transparent to accumulate evidence for or against mechanisms of behavior change. Transparent is really key here. Measurement is a key component of transparency in research and also the validity of our research. So here is the QR code. Feel free to use it. I've made sure that it works despite my technological impairment. And so when you go to the SOBC measures repository, you will see a page like this. All of these measures are accessible. You can see there's OSF documentation, Google Scholar integration, access measure. So things like downloading the measure. You can also go to GitHub and access some of the tasks. If you click on a scale, this is what you will see. And you have a lovely description of the scale with citations, the reasons why people identified it as a potential mechanism, how it was measured, whether or not this has been influenced by the intervention. So here is a little bit more filled in mediation diagram. And you can see we don't just have this mechanism up here, we have to measure it. So people who are familiar with SEM or measurement models will recognize this here, that the mechanism is up here, but we can't measure it directly. So we have these different ways that we try to tap into the mechanism. Although it's critically important to behavior change science to show that an assay can be measured, influenced, and validated, that is not enough. We also need to ensure that our measures are valid for a given mechanism. This is not always easy. Measures are not always pure measures of a single mechanism, but may capture multiple mechanistic pathways. This is problematic because you might assume that you're testing one mechanism, but you're in fact testing something else entirely. So here's an example. I might believe that I'm measuring beliefs about capabilities, but I might also accidentally be measuring beliefs about consequences. Furthermore, many of our existing measures, whether because of tradition or lack of rigorous development, may have serious flaws, things like double-barreled items. So asking, for example, if you think that you can get 30 minutes of MVP on days when it's sunny outside, which is sort of a ridiculous example, but not unheard of. You also might have measures that are tautological with your outcome. We also have problems with measurement error. If there's a lot of measurement error, it can prevent the detection of significant associations. We also have to consider levels of specificity. So believing that I'm capable of exercise is very different than believing that I'm capable of getting 30 minutes of MVPA or moderate to vigorous physical activity 5 times a week. There also might be different time scales. So am I talking about this month, last month, this week, tomorrow? And all of these are important considerations when you're designing a study. This has implications both for intervention selection and outcome measures. So you have to think about the correspondence principle. If I'm assessing your belief about your capability to exercise next week, then I shouldn't be measuring your exercise at 2 months, for example. You also might want to consider things like measurement variance, so measure specific variance. If I have a self-report mechanism and a self-report outcome, they might seem to be more related than if I have a self-report mechanism and an objective outcome. So things like accelerometer derived physical activity. This is really critical when thinking about accumulating evidence for mechanisms across fields. Many mechanisms, this is the jingle jangle part down here, may have been defined differently. You might see something with the same label, so self-efficacy and self-efficacy, but it's defined or operationalized completely differently. Conversely, you might see the same items, similar items that are tapping into what looks like the same mechanism, but they have different labels. So this is this little part right here. Is this mechanism the same? I don't know. We have to really pay attention to the items and the operationalization. How do we measure things in valid and reliable ways? What is the mechanism? That is really key. Those of you who were at the last session will recognize the Theory and Techniques tool from the Human Behavior Change Project. So the Human Behavior Change Project is a UK-based group that worked to create taxonomies of behavior change components, behavior change techniques, the little intervention components. You can see some over here, things like goal setting, and the different mechanisms, the taxonomy of potential mechanisms that they might operate through. So if I have goal setting as my intervention, will it affect knowledge? No evidence. Will it affect skills? No, it doesn't seem to, based on their study, which was a combination of expert consensus, literature review, and triangulation techniques. Inconclusive, but it does seem that if I intervene and have people set behavioral goals, that it can change intentions. So they've been linking behavior change techniques to mechanisms of action. Why does this matter? So here we go. We have what you can see here as the Human Behavior Change Project component. They are linking the intervention to a mechanism, but we really have these measures and we want to validate them with respect to mechanisms of change. So these are different pieces of that triangle, the mediation diagram. We need to operationalize our mechanisms as a measure, and we need our measures to be valid for our mechanisms, for our hypothesized mechanisms. And here you can see how these different tools relate to each other. It's very complementary. We have the behavior change techniques linked to the mechanisms, and potentially we could have our measures linked to these mechanisms as well. This, if we could really have a wonderful compendium of this, would be excellent for behavioral scientists. You might, for example, be able to click on beliefs about capabilities and see 10 different measures. And if everyone's using these measures, you might see that some measures are more malleable, or some measures are more reliable, or some measures work better for certain behaviors when talking about beliefs of capabilities. This is an aspirational goal, very far away from it, but you can see how this is important and potentially very useful for our work in our field. Our attempt to begin to harmonize the work of the Human Behavior Change Project and SOBC was a 3-round expert opinion study. Some of you may be members of societies where we recruited our experts from, things like the Society for Behavioral Medicine. And we wanted to have them link our 44 of the self-report assays from the repository, and there were 26 mechanisms of action from the Human Behavior Change Project. To myself and someone else, one of our coordinators, linked the measures to the mechanisms first by ourselves. There were more than 1,000 of them, so we did this to reduce participant burden. And we had our experts rate their agreement whether these links were related. That was a very low threshold, but we wanted to set it low because we considered this to be exploratory developmental work, and we didn't want to miss anything, and just sort of get a general sense of whether these things went together in any way. The other component of this is that you can see our 3 broad mechanistic domains of SOBC are not the same as the 26 more targeted mechanisms of the Human Behavior Change Project. So we don't have a one-to-one correspondence. Our experts also had the opportunity to suggest new links for us, so things that we missed. And then they had an online discussion forum, and then they re-rated links that did not meet our consensus benchmark. Our consensus benchmark was 50%. Again, exploratory developmental work. We didn't want to miss anything. This is our first step. They were considered to be related if 50% of more experts agreed that they were related. And when new links were suggested, if 50% or more suggested them, we considered those things to be related as well. Just a quick overview of our results. We had 167 measure mechanism links that reached our consensus benchmark. This is just a breakdown of where they came from. And we had 33 links which reached 90 to 100% consensus that they were related, which is pretty cool. Our mean agreement was 74.2%. I am going to show you now our cool looking diagram. So on the x-axis here, you can see the different mechanisms. This is a heat map. And on the y-axis are all the different measures that were included in our expert opinion study. And you can see the percent agreement denoted by the color. So we went red for more related and blue for less related, sort of like hot to cold. I originally did it the other way because I was like red for stop, but Jeff smartly told me that that was not the best way to do it. So over here, for example, you can see that behavioral regulation was considered to be related to a lot of these different measures. Many of them were related to behavioral regulation and self-image. Very few were related to social and professional role and identity. Just going to go ahead and zoom in on this a little. These are our links that reached 90% or more agreement that they were related. Again, behavioral regulation really stands out and was the most commonly identified link that was related. And you can see very few mechanisms actually hit that benchmark. All right, so back to this idea. We're trying to develop resources for behavior change scientists. And now I'm going to show you the mechanism measure tab. This is one of the really exciting things that came out of our project, our collaboration with the Human Behavior Change Project. So here I am on the measures page. I'm going ahead, scrolling down. You can see over here on the side, there are some filters that are available. So SOBC, I'm going to select that because I'm primarily interested in these mechanisms. I scroll down a little bit. I'm going to click on that same measure that I showed you earlier. You can see that you can download the measure directly. And again, the links on more information, documentation. So if I click on the measure, here's everything you saw earlier, more information about why it was identified as a mechanism, how it's measured, how it's been influenced in the past. And now this is one of the exciting components up here. You can now click and see the results of our study. You can directly see which mechanisms of action were related in our study and the behavior change techniques. The little link down there that says open the theory and techniques tool in another tab. If you click on this, it will take you directly to the theory and techniques tool. So we've greatly increased the interoperability of these two resources. And I'm going to zero in here on beliefs about capabilities. And now on that side as well, we have created interoperability. And you can see some of the results there here. They found that there was a link between problem solving and beliefs about capabilities. So if you have a problem solving intervention, then you will potentially be able to influence beliefs about capabilities. And these are some measures that are related to beliefs about capabilities. So you can see that it's potentially informative in terms of linking all of these components of the study, the behavior change techniques to the mechanism to potential measures. And here is the OSF page where you can access the data, the raw data are there. So you can look at the tables and the percent agreement yourself. And on this next slide, you can see our manuscript, which is now published. So I'm just going to pause there for a moment in case you want to screenshot or write it down, or potentially we could drop a link to the paper in the chat. I don't have the ability to do that right now because I'm talking, but feel free if someone else would like to. All right, so what next? We've clearly not solved this measure mechanism issue. We actually uncovered a number of challenges along the way overall, but we saw this as a critical first step to increase the transparency, rigor, and reproducibility of our research and a call of action to the field to create better measures. I will get into that in a moment. So one of our major accomplishments was increasing the interoperability of these two resources and these two huge groups, one UK, one US. So the theory and techniques tool is now interoperable with the SOBC measures repository. These links are preliminary. We are not prescribing certain measures, but presenting shared expert opinions on the relationship between 44 common measures and different mechanisms of action. This is not saying use this measure. This is sort of asking you to think about it. Looking at these things, thinking about the mechanisms, making sure that you're thinking about the measures when you're working on your study. And potentially if you already have a measure and then you can find your mechanism, thinking about how you might want to design your intervention. It's really critical that we pay attention to the valid measure of our mechanisms. If we are trying to create causal inference, we need to understand and be correct about what it is that we are measuring. We might think we're testing one mechanistic pathway, but we're testing something else entirely. What are some of the problems that we ran into? Well, lack of shared definitions, poor measurement practices, different levels of specificity are big problems in terms of selecting measures. There are also big issues with things like double-barreled items or measurement error or all sorts of things. Too much to get into right now, but we are not always great at creating reliable and valid measures, and we're not always great at making sure these measures are valid for our mechanisms. There are barriers, unfortunately, to the creation of new measures or comprehensive validation of previously created measures. These things take time and money. It's not very sexy research. It's not always very fundable research, but it is absolutely critical. Otherwise, the validity of all of our studies is called completely into question. We really need to improve our measures. We need to refine them, and we need to develop new ones. Right now, the next project that I'm currently involved in is confirming some of these links and refining them further by mapping from a starting point, the 167 links from this study, to a new and more detailed mechanisms ontology, which Susan Mickey, her recent grad student, just defended her PhD. We're working on this together. They might have shown you that expanded mechanism ontology. And this project, we're actually saying, does this measure seem to actually measure this component of the mechanism ontology? So that's sort of changing it from just being related. Is it related? Okay. Is it measuring some aspect of this mechanism better? The other limitation is just that this is limited to the measures in the SOBC repository. So it's clearly not every measure that could have been included. That would have been too many lifetimes of work. So let's go back to our fundamental question. How are we measuring our mechanisms of behavior change? We do so in many different ways, and that's fine. That's not wrong or bad. We need many different measures to accommodate different contexts, but without being systematic, this can prevent us from creating a cumulative science. We need to make sure that we're measuring mechanisms. Everyone's measuring the same mechanism in a valid way, so we can draw inference and find patterns across studies. We also want to be parsimonious. We don't want to have too many new measures for everything. We want to have good, valid measures to capture what we're interested in and make sure that we are operationalizing things consistently. Having this shared language is really important. I don't know if any of you have, I'm sure many of you have done interdisciplinary work, and sometimes you look at someone like they're speaking a complete foreign language, even though it feels like I have trouble sometimes. I'll talk to a clinical psychologist. I'm a social psychologist. I'm like, what? What is that word? What are you talking about? And that's not helpful. We need to operationalize and not just use a label. We need to be very clear. So let's fill in that and ... In addition to promoting the SOBC methods, we really want to focus on the importance of measuring mechanisms for valid behavioral science. We need valid measures of our mechanisms in order for valid hypothesis tests to be able to generalize and to be able to create cumulative science, better interventions, more effective interventions. I am going to close with a little nod to study design. You might think, aha, this little mediation triangle is pretty simplistic. This looks like a traditional RCT. We have an intervention, we have a mechanism, we have a behavior. But we know that research is more complex. There are many more designs. How do we generalize? Well, the good thing about it being in this simplistic form is that it generalizes quite nicely. I am going to talk about how you might apply this in a sequential multiple assignment randomization trial or a SMART study. I will give one very important caveat. I am no expert in SMART study designs, but I'm going to talk about mechanisms. So here we have a randomization. You get either a behavior change technique 1 or behavior change technique 2. And I might think that behavior change technique 1 is working with mechanism 1 to influence behavior. Behavior change 2 is with mechanism 2 to influence behavior. So these are the dark arrows. I would expect this little mediation pathway to work here, but not this one. I would expect this mediation pathway to work here, but not this one. For space, I'm going to zero in on this bottom component. So let's say you're randomized to BCT2. I then measure behavior. If you've responded, I continue. You continue with BCT2, I expect it to continue working through mechanism 2, and I expect it to keep influencing behavior in the positive direction. If you are a non-responder, I am going to re-randomize you. So now let's say I add behavior change component 1. Now I expect this to work through both mechanistic pathways. So you expect mechanism 1 to work and mechanism 2 to work. And for this person, let's say I'm randomizing you to an enhanced version of 2. So I still expect it only to target mechanism 2. So here you can see only that dark arrow down here. I will say something that's very obvious. You cannot do this if you are not measuring your mechanisms. It is critical to measure your mechanisms. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen a trial that is theory informed and they do not actually measure the mechanism that they hypothesize is going to lead to their behavior change. All right, so here is our first pause for questions. I don't know if I should stop sharing.
It might be nice to see your face, Talea.
I will stop sharing.
Good. Thank you so much. That was a lot of information. Requests for links for the websites. They're in the chat now, so people can see the links there. And there are indeed a few questions, Talea. One of the questions is, do you consider social determinants as mechanisms?
Social determinants. So I think that's a great question. It depends what the person means by social determinants. If it is something that cannot be changed, then I do not consider it a mechanism. But if it is something that can be changed, then it could be a mechanism. It's just that your intervention would look different. So let's talk about, let's say, let's just say poverty. And this is like a huge
funny. That's what I
thing.
thought.
Yeah. If I can change someone's poverty with a policy intervention and that results in a change in behavior or a change in whatever it is that I'm working on, that is a mechanism. It's really about level. So I can zoom in or I can zoom out. And you might think, well, there are a bunch of mechanisms. That's true. There are mechanisms that lead to mechanisms that lead to mechanisms that lead to behavior. But it's really about the level of analysis. There are mechanisms that operate on a much larger, more macro level, and there are mechanisms that operate very zoomed in on a micro level. And this is why you have to be very clear about specifying your intervention, your mechanism, measuring it, and also then selecting your intervention components. So if my intervention was beliefs about capabilities and my mechanism was poverty, that would make absolutely no sense at all, right? So it's really about matching at the appropriate level all of the components of your design.
Other questions, Talea. Are the mechanisms that you're focused on mostly at the level of the client-patient level or also on the provider organizational level?
Great question.
When Christina reviewed the materials, she noticed that some of them seem to be mostly at the client level.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question for a couple of reasons. One, we keep the presentation of the materials very simplistic because it's more accessible. And then I think you have to then take that and sort of generalize it to other contexts. Absolutely, you could have something at the provider level. And we are very lucky actually because Brian, our fantastic masterclass person, is going to be talking about something like that himself. But you can see, I don't know, let's say I want to increase uptake of the COVID vaccine. And I intervene with providers and I'm giving them an education intervention so that they talk more about it, or I give them pamphlets to hand out or something. And as long as they're engaging in that behavior, that could be my mechanism. That behavior could be a mechanism. See, it's not always clear cut. But then I might say, I have multiple mechanisms. Something that the provider is doing is the first mechanism being changed by my intervention, which is changing a mechanism in the individual. Maybe it's motivation, maybe it's in skills, who knows? And then I'm getting the patient behavior as the outcome or the client behavior as the outcome. So yes, you absolutely can have mechanisms operating within different individuals, parents and children. Maybe I'm interested in child's temper tantrum behavior and I want to intervene with the parent, and by getting the parent to interact differently with their child, I'm affecting the child's behavior. So it doesn't always have to be person A, person A, person A.
And do I understand correctly that the measures that are there can be adjusted to look at a different level, another level than the patient level?
So our measures repository is not comprehensive. If you need a specific kind of measure, I cannot guarantee you will find it there. It's actually only 44, so it's very likely that you might not. But you could, and if you can, it's great because we have citations and information and scoring and download, and we're working actually on expanding the repository. We're about to upload many more measures, so this is a growing beast. So I don't know if that addressed the question. Measures certainly can be adapted, but I can't say to just do that willy-nilly. I just went down this huge rabbit hole of making sure your measures are validated with respect to your population and all of these other things. So making up something new is always a little bit risky in that regard, unless you have the ability to comprehensively validate within your population. Yeah.
And we have another question from Michaela Santilli. What do you think are the reasons why scientists choose to measure one mechanism of action and not another? Probably before deciding which measure they want to use, and then there is a ... So I think it's the first question that really matters. What do you think are the reasons why scientists choose to measure one mechanism or another mechanism?
I think it's theory. It's what you've seen. It's theory. Like, this is where I might read about, I don't know, the IMB model and decide that motivation is my mechanism because it's information, motivation, behavior. And I'm like, I want to really intervene and change motivation. I really want to intervene and change the information that people have. So it could be that you're drawing from a theory. It could be that you're drawing from intuition. That's fine too. Who knows? It's better to have some sort of background. It could be that you read another paper and you're like, wow, that really seems like this is what should be changing and driving the behavior. It might be that you go to the theory and techniques tool and you look at a link and you say, CBT seems to be affecting something like this. There's no right answer. And actually, one of the things that's cool about being clear with all of this work and hopefully accumulating across many studies over time is that we'd be able to find evidence for these mechanistic pathways. It's not a-theoretical, it's sort of trans-theoretical, right? Many of these theories share common mechanisms.
Then we have a question from Samuel Meisel. He says that the diagrams presented in this talk seem to depict mediators and not mechanisms. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how SOBC differentiates between mediators and mechanisms? Is the evidence base lacking? Is the evidence base linking? Behavior change techniques to mechanisms linking actual mechanisms or mediators? So
they're one and the same.
They're one and the same.
Our mechanisms are mediators. We're using that language because we're avoiding the statistical language. So for me, I'm a social psychologist by training. We're more often in the lab. We're more interested. We're more basic. We're more mechanism mediation. But so I was surprised. I'm like, really? People don't get trained in this? But it's true. When I first joined, and it's wonderful, this is a big plug for interdisciplinary work, you think that you know something or that people are aware of something within your field because it seems very basic, but it's not. And I think focusing on statistical language is a mistake because it's really not about knowing the statistical model, it's about knowing the process. We all infer causality. This is just the nature of being human. We make up reasons for things when they don't exist. We make up causal reasons. And so using a common language that really makes explicit this mechanistic component will result in a mediation test. But that's not where I want to start, right? I want to start with this idea of what's your causal story, and then get people to measure it and conduct these statistical analyses.
Okay, the next question helps us to move on to the next section of this session. Vanessa Kircher asked, could you give us an example of how you're applying the SOBC to the work you're doing?
I could. I think it's better, if this is okay, to launch into the masterclass.
Exactly.
And then if that's not fully addressed, there will be time for questions after the masterclass. And then you are more than welcome to ask that question again if I have not answered it. Perfect. I am going to share my screen very, very quickly. I'm not even going to go into slideshow mode, but oops, you can see here there are 2 QR codes to access the measures page and also the theory and techniques tool. The links are also in the chat, so maybe this wasn't necessary. And then the worksheet, there was a link to the worksheet, so make sure you access this. This is what Brian and I are going to be going over now. I'm going to stop sharing and let Brian share his screen instead.
Hi. Okay, great. This is really, that was excellent, Talia. Do you want me to share my worksheet?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yep. Okay. All right, can you all see that? Is it visible, the worksheet?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
Perfect.
Great.
And if anyone is curious and still has not accessed it, we just had the worksheet file dropped into the chat again. Thank you so much for sharing that. All right, so usually we start with a problem, right? We have a behavior that we want to change, and that's kind of the point. So Brian, what is the behavior that you want to change?
All right, so I'm an HIV researcher, and I'm interested in HIV-related stigma and how do we reduce that, particularly among healthcare workers. So I have a project in which I'm trying to reduce stigma specifically toward anal sex. And the behavior is that I'm trying to encourage healthcare workers who have some kind of responsibility for HIV services to initiate a discussion about anal pleasure and anal health with their clients.
Great. Okay, so I know we have an already filled out worksheet. This is something that we talked about ahead of time, just not to have to type everything in, but I'm
revealing it now.
Revealing it now. And I just want to point out for the person who asked about provider targeted mechanisms, that this is could be a double whammy, right? We have an intervention. There's some mechanism we haven't got to yet. We want to change a provider behavior, which ultimately leads to a change for the clients in some sort of mechanism that leads to a change in client behavior to promote client health. So you can see it's not just one intervention, one mechanism, one behavior, but there are multiple causal chains, and it really is about what you want to focus on. Okay, great. So we have our behavior. Now, what is the mechanism? What do you think is underlying a change in provider behavior?
Okay, so this is where it gets a little complicated. So I'm going to show a conceptual model that was kind of the original conceptual model when I was writing the grant. And now we're in the process of analyzing in-depth interviews with healthcare workers and with clients. And this is particularly focused on gay and bisexual men as the client population, if there is an effect on those mechanisms. So what you can see is these are behavior change techniques that we posited, as we were writing the grant, and the mechanisms of action. And then, just like Talia, you just said, the hope is it has an effect on healthcare workers, but also has an effect at the clinical site level on referrals among MSM and their engagement in HIV services. So these are the mechanisms that I originally posited.
Great. Okay, so again, you can see you might actually be able to find an arrow. Oh, you do. You have that little arrow between the healthcare worker and the clinical site level. Yeah, and actually one of your mechanisms, I want to point this out as well, is a more macro level mechanism. So context and resources, so things like policy. Okay, great. Let's go back to the worksheet then. So when we're talking about your different mechanisms of action, you had a number of them. Let's just talk. Let's talk about all your mechanisms for a second.
Do you want me to mention all of them and go back to the diagram, or just sort of reveal?
No, let's just reveal them.
Okay.
Because we saw the diagram. Yeah. Okay, so based on that diagram, it seems like there are many different things that you want to change. You want to change empathy, comfort with sexuality, knowledge, skills, attitudes, and motivation. So that's a whole host of mechanisms that you want to impact in order to change this behavior. That makes it a little more complicated. Especially, I want to just point one thing out. If you have an RCT and I'm trying to target all of these mechanisms in one lump sum, one lump intervention, it's a little hard to tease out which behavior change components are affecting which mechanism. So I don't necessarily get information about that. This is where you might think about things like smart designs or smart trials, right? Where you can look at different combinations. So does this thing specifically target empathy? Does this thing specifically target knowledge? And you can get to tease apart some of these causal pathways. This is way, way better than not including mechanisms at all, right? But you can see how it might be more difficult to tease apart which causal pathways are operating. But this is
I
good.
have a
Okay, so yeah.
I have actually two questions for you. So one, this is a pilot study. So, you know, we don't have the resources to do a smart design, and it's going to be a small sample. So then I'm curious, like, what's your process for determining, like, really what's the mechanism that's the most important one? And this is tied to a second question, which came up, I think, from Christina about, you know, mechanisms that are not just at the individual level. And one of the things that we're hearing in our interviews is that there need to be resources for providers to be able to initiate this discussion. So they can't just sort of go in cold. They need to have posters or signs or pins and materials. But that's something that I don't recall seeing in the repository. So how do you approach that kind of problem?
Well, yeah, I mean, not everything's going to be in the repository, first of all. So how would I approach this? I have one comment, which is some things are moderators and not mechanisms. So like if I have all of the stuff in place but no time to do it, then time might be a moderator. So you want to be clear about whether some of the contextual things are moderators versus mechanisms. The other thing that I would say, and I have to say this because I'm a statistician, you can't do a lot in a small pilot study if you don't have power to do it. When I do a pilot study, I'm often doing acceptability, appropriateness, feasibility, things like that. And what I would do is measure my mechanisms to the best of my ability. Hopefully they're in the right direction. And I would use the lower bound of the confidence interval for a power analysis, which is a very unsatisfying answer for what you just asked. But you can't really conduct, it has to be well powered. That's just important for valid science as well. However, you could measure all of these things. This is not a place where you would tease it apart, right? But what you might find is that some of them are really standing out as potentially in the right direction, depending on how large your sample is. Like some pilots are 10 people, some are 50. And you might find some in the opposite direction. Of course, it could be a fluke, but I would say just measure them, take a look, and maybe then zero in on what seems to be the most promising. Because one of the cool things about doing this method, if you do this in a very large, well-powered study, for example, and we find that we can change provider empathy all we want, but that has no relation to their behavior, then that's not the appropriate thing to focus on in an intervention. We're increasing empathy, but it's not having an effect, at least on what we are measuring. So there's my unsatisfying answer.
It's actually a satisfying answer because it is a pilot study, and part of this is just the feasibility of being able to measure these different things and derive measures that are actually the appropriate ones to use. Yeah. Measuring
it is an important component. So what is your theoretical support? Why do you think these mechanisms are related to this behavior? And you can go ahead and this is where you would look at the literature in your own field. This is where you would maybe look and say, it doesn't exist in HIV research, but maybe it's in cancer research, for example. So what have you found to support this?
Okay, so it's a stigma intervention. And even though stigma is not named in the behavior, anal sex is really stigmatized behavior, and part of why we're encouraging providers or operating to try to get providers to talk about it is because they're reluctant to do that because they feel uncomfortable about it. And they're worried about stigmatizing their clients by talking about it. So there's intergroup contact theory, which is a major theory in stigma reduction. And that's about reducing prejudice through managing interpersonal contact. So we think that there's going to be some exchange between healthcare providers and then other people who are in, I'll just reveal now, we're planning on some sort of continuing education workshop. So there'll be providers, and then there'll be people who also are like from the community who have engaged in anal sex. So there's going to be some exchange of information in that process.
Great.
And providers themselves as well.
Right. So what you can see then here is that you've gone to the theory and you've found something that seems to work in the way that you're anticipating. And I actually think we should skip the others for the sake of time. So let's just focus on that top row. Are there studies that show that this works within the context of HIV?
Yes.
Wonderful.
There's a pilot study on which I'm basing this, and then there's other stigma research that.
Wonderful.
Yes.
So this is your R01, right? Like this is where you're writing your background session. You're saying, this is my behavior. This is my mechanism. I've shown that this mechanism is related to this type of behavior. I know, like that's you're constructing an argument. So let's go to the next one. Let's zero in on your mechanism. All right, how are we measuring? By the way,
this is where,
very cool. This hiding and revealing.
Yeah, it's tricky. So I would say that let's skip knowledge and skills, because that's not really what we're talking about with this mechanism.
Let's talk about empathy.
Yeah, empathy. Yeah.
So Jefferson scale of empathy. What do you know about this measure? Is it reliable, valid? I mean, it says empathy in the title, but we can't rely on labels.
Yeah, it is reliable. It's valid. One of the issues I've got is that it's sort of a general measure of empathy. And so providers could have a general sense of empathy, but if it's not specific to this particular topic or to sexuality, then is it exactly the thing that we really need to be measuring?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
Yeah. So I think there probably needs to be some kind of adaptation of it. And there are some items there that I can imagine adapting. And we have some history of adapting measures, like the social support measure. We've adapted to be more specific to anal sex. So we've done that before.
Well, for people who are really into measurement, there are things like reliability, so internal consistency, or test retest. There's also validity, so content, face, discriminant, convergent validity, and we don't have time often to do all of this in our studies. One sort of lower effort thing, especially, and also you have to consider, is it too specific to be useful at some point? Mm-hmm. Which I can't tell you when it is or not. I have seen Diane and Susan and everyone talk so much. Did Diane talk about discriminant content validity in the last session?
I don't think so. Okay,
so anyone who's interested in this should look up Diane Dixon, Dixon, and Mary Johnston, Marie Johnston. They do a lot of work on measurement validity, and they have a technique where they actually rate the relatedness of each item in a scale to an operational definition of their mechanism. And so that's a way that you can take a measure, even when it's already created, and say, 7 out of the 10 items really did only load onto this mechanism. People agreed, and the other 3 did not. I will find a link of theirs later, and drop that in the chat when Jeff is talking.
Thanks.
All right, so let's keep going, because we want to have some time for questions.
All right.
All right, how are you going to influence empathy?
All right, so I'm going to now go to, this is the theory and techniques tool, and empathy is here somewhere. There's emotion. I'm not sure. I don't think
empathy is actually on here.
Empathy is not. Yeah. It could be under.
There's no empathy. It's okay, but I think we maybe picked the wrong one. We could have focused on skills, right? And then we could skip to skills, so we can click on skills, because that was one of your mechanisms as well, right?
It was, yeah. Yep.
All right, so scroll down.
So there's instruction on how to perform behavior. So this is definitely something we've heard in our interviews as well. They don't know exactly how to initiate the conversation. So I can imagine using that. Behavioral practice and rehearsal certainly could use that. And then graded tasks also make sense, because providers can be fairly anxious about doing this, particularly with the stigmatized topic. So approaching it in slow exposure, graded ways would be helpful.
Awesome. So let's go back to your worksheet and just take the quickest peek at your intervention, trying to get mindful of time.
Yes. All right. So I had put those things.
There you go.
There it is. Okay.
And now, so you've identified them, but why? So this is sort of where we're still working on our background section of our R01. We found an intervention. We think these things will work. Why do you think that's going to work?
What do I think in terms of skills?
What's your theoretical support that these components of of an intervention will influence skills? So what's your theoretical support linking the intervention to the mechanism or the behavior?
Okay, So there are a couple of different things here, and I'm gonna jump ahead. I'm gonna actually reveal something. We've got the theory and techniques tool, but Teo and I and a couple of other people who actually in the seminar have worked on a systematic review of stigma interventions to reduce HIV-related stigma in healthcare settings, and it kind of actually looks a little bit like the theory and techniques tool. So this is kind of the basis for trying to understand what the empirical support is here. And I think when you say the theoretical basis, do you mean like just the theory? Do you mean the empirical support as well?
Both.
Both? Okay.
So yeah, I mean, this is really where you want to show evidence, and it's not just showing that the BCT, you can find both, right? The BCT seems to influence the behavior, but it also seems to influence the mechanism. So we want evidence for the indirect effect, the direct effect, anything that you can garner support why you think this intervention will work.
Yeah. Okay.
Defending the mediation.
So I'll just share, like, this is one source of information about this. So what we've done is we've looked at these different interventions, and there are more interventions than this, but these are the ones that used some kind of control group and also showed some effects. And so what you're seeing over here is you're seeing behavior change techniques, and one of them is instruction on how to perform a behavior. Another one is demonstration of behavior, behavioral practice and rehearsal. These are things that we just talked about. Mm-hmm. And then over here, you're seeing the mechanisms that are most associated with interventions that had these, that use these techniques. So
you've been very thorough, right? You've already done this review separately, and you don't have to do this when you're writing your R01, right? This is just Ryan's amazing project, which you should also check out.
Okay, so this is some of the basis of that. And then if we go back to the worksheet, I think we're still trying to look at other sources in the literature, like on other kinds of interventions in healthcare settings that demonstrate that instruction on how to perform a behavioral practice and rehearsal and graded tasks would be relevant. But there are things like hand washing, like getting providers to
let's
wash their
reveal
hands, right?
Let's reveal that last square, and then I'm so sorry, Brian, this is just so easy to talk about, but we should keep going. So
so I haven't added that stuff here. It's just something that we talked about before.
Right. So, but you already showed it. This is where you would cite the studies. You'd show that the intervention, that instructions change behaviors or instructions change skills. You would find that evidence and you'd put it in there. And here now you have your beautiful R01. And if you scroll down, here's a diagram that you could fill in. So let's say if, Brian, you were going to fill in the diagram, you might say intervention would be things like graded tasks. The mechanism is skills. We're measuring this by not the Jefferson empathy scale, but whichever measure that you chose. And the behavior is providers speaking with their clients.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop us now because we have 2 minutes for questions. I want to make sure Jeff has enough time. I'm so sorry for rushing at the end. I'm just trying to be mindful.
So much to cover. There are several questions, and one in a way repeats what we have gone over, but I think it's good to ask that question. So Rajan, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, asks, often in applied work, an intervention will target multiple mechanisms of action. For example, we might have a community event in which we show videos, stimulate discussions, offer testimonials from doers, and this might affect knowledge, attitude, skills, self-efficacy to do a behavior, emotional response tied to the behavior, and so on. And this may be one of several interventions launched in the program to affect the behavior that we try to change. In this case, what is your best advice for teasing apart mechanisms at work on changing behaviors?
Yeah, this is really where study design is key. This is where a large group where you can test different combinations or different components would be really good for testing the different causal pathways and for theory building. And you might say, I just want to throw in the kitchen sink and make a difference. And that's better than nothing, way better than nothing. Just measure all of your mechanisms. However, the benefit of teasing some of this apart is that you might find, like I said earlier, that you can increase empathy all you want, but it doesn't change behavior. But it might be really just this motivation that's changing the behavior that you want. And so understanding which pieces allows us to have more efficient and targeted interventions. If we know that it's really motivation we need to focus on, let's get the best intervention for changing motivation. So I would say measure them rather than not measuring them. If you can tease them apart by design, try to.
Okay, and now we have an ontological question.
Oh boy.
That refers to the last session. What are the key attributes of a mechanism? Are these mechanisms all cognitive level? How can we decide, okay, that is the mechanism?
Mechanisms are not all cognitive level. They can be similar to the question about policy or things that change. Let's talk about, let's say that our outcome is an attitude. Let's say that our outcome is attitudes towards gay marriage. We know that the change, the legal change, changed attitudes. So it could, making gay marriage legal changed individual attitudes. So we don't have to have everything be at one specific level. Some things do operate from one level and affect another level of specificity. And can you just repeat the beginning of the question?
So what are the key attributes of a mechanism?
The key attribute of a mechanism is that it's modifiable. If you cannot change it, it is not a mechanism. That would be what I would say. Yeah. Other than that, it can be very flexible.
And
I'm gonna make it really confusing now, because we can talk about it in different fields in different ways. This is not what I talk about, but let's say that my outcome is mortality. My mechanism could be a behavior. It could be quitting smoking. Right? So you can think about this at all sorts of different levels. However, when we're really talking about those things are more commonly tested. There are lots of things that link behavior to health outcomes, but thinking about what is it that's changing to change this initial step, what is it that we're trying to get to happen to get to this point in the causal pathway is really, really key. And there can be multiple mechanisms, and really sometimes it's just a matter of focus and preference. You cannot do everything in one. I wish you could, but you can't. And it's not even a lifetime of work or 2 or 10.
Any suggestions for how to make these decisions?
That's look at the literature. Yeah, I would look at the literature. Where are the gaps in the literature? What don't we understand? Maybe we have no idea how to change hand washing behavior. Maybe we have no idea how to change provider comfort with speaking about HIV or anal sex or pleasure. And we know that that matters, but we don't know how or why that changes. Focus on the gaps, find that gap and convince the reviewers that that's what you want to study, and measure your mechanism and figure out the most powerful mechanism and target that and make a big public health impact.
Good. I think this is the moment to switch to Jeff.
Yes, I think so too. Let's have Jeff. He's going to give his own perspective on working with the SOBC method. I don't know if we're allowed to run a little over, but I can certainly stay and answer some questions at the end.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Can everybody see the screen here?
Yes, we can.
And I can no longer see you. So I appreciate if you continue fielding questions as they come in. Thanks so much for this great opportunity to speak here and the excellent questions that people are asking. And it's a great conversation to be having. So I just wanted to offer, sort of as we start to wrap up here, some sort of thoughts about benefits and challenges of applying the SOBC method to one's own research. So this is something that I have experience with as an affective scientist, trying to reduce fear of recurrence in cardiac patients, for example, to change their health behaviors, ultimately as a sort of distal health behavior goal, including things like medication non-adherence and physical activity deficits. But we also have experience as the RCC members in sort of consulting with people who are doing precisely what was happening here today, trying to formulate their own research design, sometimes, for creating a project or writing a grant proposal. And these are some of the things that we've seen come up repeatedly. And in fact, we've seen it in some of the questions here. So I'm going to start with 3 challenges. So a big one is ensuring that each chosen measure, so each measured mechanism, is valid, reliable, and appropriate for your research context. So I didn't plan this, but it came up really nicely in Brian's presentation here with the Jefferson scale of empathy, that perhaps it's a totally valid and reliable measure, but it may not be fully appropriate for the particular research context in this HIV provider context that you're studying. And so getting all 3 of those things to work together is sometimes more of a challenge than you might expect. So in general, the approach to this is as a first step, if possible, use tested assays with good psychometric characteristics. So do that whenever you can. And in particular, we recommend 3 things. So having good convergent validity, good discriminant validity, and also high internal consistency reliability, assuming that you're using maybe a self-report measure as your measure of the mechanism. Sometimes that's not possible. And if not, then modifying existing assays can be appropriate. And if you're going to go that route, we recommend 2 things, or I guess I'll put this on myself. So I recommend 2 things: to modify the wording of the scale items as little as possible. So it's as close to the validated version of the scale as it can be. And then also in terms of the, publishing manuscripts eventually after the study design and data collection and analysis, be sure to report all the modifications transparently so that everyone is fully aware of the exact modifications and the rationale for them. And then third, sometimes neither of those things is possible, and development of entirely new assays can also be appropriate. It does need to be done where there are gaps, as Talea was just pointing out. But it shouldn't be the first option you consider. So sometimes it's easy to jump to that third one, but just consider what measures do exist that may be appropriate. If you do choose that third route, we highly recommend collaborating with researchers who have experience with scale development. So things like exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis in the case of developing new self-report measures. Okay. A second big challenge that we've seen, this one is a little more particular to certain research questions, but ensure that your measured mechanism and your measured behavior are conceptually very distinct. We can't really build a cumulative science of behavior change with this mechanistic approach unless we really make sure those things are distinct. And you might wonder why I'm even putting this point up, but one of the things we've seen is sometimes, let's say you're trying to change a particular behavior, and the intervention actually gets people to engage in that behavior. And then it's tempting to measure a mechanism that itself is related to the behavioral target. So if you're trying to get people to be more physically active and less sedentary, you might have them engage in brief bouts of exercise. But then the question is, what mechanism is appropriate? If your intervention is exercise and your behavior is physical activity, what mechanism is going to be appropriate there? And so it's just something to be thoughtful about. There's some clarifications though, and actually this came up in the questions. It is actually acceptable for the assay of a mechanism to be operationalized as a behavioral measure. So to start with sort of a non-controversial example, many mechanisms are psychological constructs. They might be things, cognitive features relating to self-control or self-regulation. So attentional control, or the ability to focus or switch attention between tasks, that can and often is measured behaviorally using a response time metric from a lab-based task. And that would be totally acceptable to use as a mechanism, even though it's technically a behavior. But it's even acceptable for a mechanism to be a behavior at the conceptual level. So thinking in the domain of HIV-related research questions, increased disclosure of HIV status could be your mechanism of interest. And of course, that is a behavior, and you're hoping to modify that through some kind of educational intervention, let's say. So that's totally an acceptable thing to do. And it depends on your research question, but it might be entirely reasonable. And just a little caveat here, in that case, however, note that you'd likely want to assess at least one additional mechanism that may explain the effect of the intervention on the disclosure behavior itself on the pathway to the final behavioral outcome of interest in your study. But just the takeaway point for this is that the key is to ensure that your mechanism, your behavior are conceptually distinct. So just be sure to consider that. Third challenge that we've seen come up is that a test of mediation should ideally employ a time-ordered relationship among variables. So this is something that's true outside of SOBC. And this question came up as well, are these mechanisms or are they mediators? And its mediation in the service of studying mechanisms is entirely consistent with and a core part of the SOBC method. And so having this time-ordered relationship is ideal because if possible, the mediator should occur in time between the predictor and outcome. To achieve that, it's important to consider the relevant timescales in your research design in terms of a couple things. One being the expected effects. So how much time do you need for these expected effects to emerge and be measurable? And also in terms of practical considerations, are you able to have your research participants come back for follow-up or linger in the clinic during, after the intervention or whatever timescale is appropriate for what you're looking at. So something to think about in advance. You might consider measuring changes in M and changes in Y, so your measured mechanism and your behavioral outcome. And that's consistent with the SOBC method, of course, that sort of final stage of it. But just again, another caveat here, keep in mind that a well-powered randomized controlled trial actually does not require measurement of M or Y at baseline. So randomization in theory should take care of that with a well-powered trial. Another thing that comes up often is people will, opt to do cross-sectional research because it's relatively easy to conduct, and it makes sense that might be a preferred choice. However, it's really important to think of the pros and cons here. So it may have less utility to do cross-sectional research than doing a thoughtfully sequenced research design in which the progression of X to M to Y is evaluated over time. X being the intervention here, the manipulation. Okay, just a couple benefits. Let me check on time here. I want to make sure there's a little chance for some questions to wrap up here, but there are many benefits. So the big one is by testing mechanism engagement, you can help advance the development of effective interventions. So that's what we're here to do, is to build a cumulative science of behavior change and to use this mechanistic approach to achieve that. So just to give an example, imagine that your study is testing 3 potential mechanisms at once, and I just threw out some examples. So perceived social support, positive affect, and self-efficacy. Again, also to refer to the questions that have come up in this session, yes, many of the mechanisms that we tend to talk about are at the personal level, but they don't have to be. SOBC has just sort of started for the most part at the individual level. So that's the example here. So let's say in one scenario, you have sort of mixed findings. So the intervention engages just one of your 3 tested mechanisms, but let's say it turns out not to be one that's been previously shown to be most strongly associated with the health behavior of interest, which again, in the context of HIV research, let's say that's ARV adherence. So if that's the pattern of findings you have, you should likely conclude, okay, your intervention might be missing some key ingredients. And just knowing that points clearly to next steps and helps you advance the development of effective interventions. In the second scenario, imagine the intervention does engage the key hypothesized mechanism and maybe several others. Your intervention in that case should likely be tested in a larger randomized trial. And in that way, you're developing effective interventions because you're proceeding with the one that you're currently testing. So I would argue that a weakly successful trial with mechanistic support is actually more valuable than a powerfully successful trial in which no putative mechanisms were measured at all. So we hope in listening to us talk about this for 90 minutes here that you agree with this assessment. So first of all, the findings are going to be more informative and more useful to you personally as a researcher moving forward. But also potentially other researchers' confidence in your positive findings may be bolstered. And that is especially going to be true if it can be shown that not only does an intervention, quote unquote, work, that it changes the behavior in question, but that you have some evidence about why it works using this mediation mechanism-focused approach, which is, of course, the whole point of the workshop today. Let's see. I want to make a brief sort of shout out here for a new SOBC relevant resource that's coming soon, which is the checklist for investigating mechanisms and behavior change research. So similar to other research-oriented checklists, so PRISMA, for example, preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis, this CLIMBER checklist is designed to really walk you through the stages that are needed to do good experimental medicine approach research in terms of the design of your experiments, but also, or studies, I should say, and also the reporting of the findings of that research. So that will be coming in the next few months. It's that we're finalizing the checklist now, and it will be published and made available. And we hope it will be something that's helpful. So I want to thank all of you for listening. This is a representation of the members of the Resource and Coordinating Center at SOBC. as well as members of the Human Behavior Change Project that's closely aligned with SOBC, as you heard. And thank you all very much for your attention. So this is our contact information. Just want to be sure that you have that for Dr. Cornelius and for me. I think I finished ahead of time. I was so worried about running out of time.
No, that's perfect. This gives us 5 more minutes. I only wanted to make one quick clarification, just because I think it's an important point. When Jeff was talking about cross-sectional research, it's not the same as like a survey, right? So the intervention will always precede your measurement of M and Y. So it's not everything all at once. It's measuring M and Y at once, just
That's
to
a good
make that one
clarification.
point.
Yes.
And we can stop sharing. I will type our emails in the chat as well, and we can take some final questions.
There are indeed a lot of interesting questions, and we cannot go over them all. But there is a very stimulating question that Matti Heino asked. And the question is, what are some of your favorite arguments for why the linear causality paradigm of mediation models applies to nonlinear dynamics that govern how complex systems like humans operate?
Aha, this is a generalization question. No, that's a really good question. I would argue that, and someone told me they didn't agree with me once and they never explained it, and I'm very sad about this. I would argue that many of our statistical models, they're simplifications. They all are. We cannot capture everything. We pick our variables, we pick certain things. And it doesn't have to be even a simple linear thing in order to start to understand causality or causal pathways. I can have nonlinear coupling dynamics within a dyad, for example, where I'm looking at emotion contagion. And so let's say that I have a certain intervention where I'm trying to reduce emotion contagion. And maybe that's my mechanism. And I can do this complex modeling and pull out these, I don't even know how to describe these. They're called oscillator models. They're not my specialty either. And then whatever I take from that, I can try to relate that to behavior. Or for example, I can see I'm doing an intervention to change relationship satisfaction. And now are people who are more satisfied going to have less negative emotion contagion in this complex model? So all of this can be generalized. That's again why the question about calling it mediation, I try not to do that. I try to just talk about the causal story, because if you start with a causal story, you can then take it and apply it to all these complex ways of testing hypotheses or looking at the world. And you don't have to feel like you're boxed in or starting from this linear standpoint.
Final question. And we do have to end at 11, unfortunately. The final question is, would a quantitative instrument, for instance, a questionnaire, be better than a qualitative instrument to indicate that a measure of mechanism influences a behavior?
Jeff, you want to take this?
Certainly, the SOBC method is designed to be looked at with quantitative measures, which is not to say that qualitative research is outside the domain of SOBC framework, but certainly what we're going to recommend is that, and we focus on it in terms of validity and reliability of your measured mechanism. We're assuming that you're using a quantitative instrument. I don't know if you have thoughts, Talea, in addition.
Yeah, I would simply add that everything has its place. And qualitative work could be really important for understanding which mechanisms are in play. What do the providers think? What do your clients think? What does your target population think? And getting that feedback can really inform what it is that you focus on. That being said, we all know that we don't understand our own behavior. And I might really think that X, Y, or Z is why my behavior is changing, and I could be completely wrong. So that's sort of this iterative development. What do people think is going on? What do the theories say? What do people think? What are they telling you? Measure it. Is that actually what's happening? So I think both things have their place. And qualitative is also a funny way of putting it. There are some measures that are quantitative, but they're qualitative coding. So coding the number of times I say we in a discussion about my illness with my partner is a qualitative measure, but quantitative because I'm counting and looking at the proportion of we-ness. I'm trying to measure the dyadic appraisal, for example. Again, everything has its place. When it comes to an actual mechanism causal test, we need something that can be quantified that we can put into a statistical model.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Talea. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Brian. Again, very inspiring session. And fortunately, there is a third session in this series where we are going to be very concrete, in which Dr. Kathleen Sikkema will talk about her work over the past 15 or 20 years or 30 years. And she has been studying mechanisms in relation to mental health interventions. So that's going to be very practical, and it's going to, in a way, repeating a lot of things that have been said today, but in the context of her research. So more opportunities to learn. Again, all the people who participated, thank you so much for being here. You can register for the next session. This session is being recorded. That link will be made available to everybody on the who is participating today. Jeff, Talea, Brian, thank you really for all the material that you gave us and help us to think and do better work in the future. So thank you all. Have a very good day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.